In the history of scientific investigation, there are findings that get ignored, not because they are weak, but because they are inconvenient, not disproven, not adequately explained, not addressed by counter-evidence, ignored, filed under interesting anomalies, and quietly set aside while the mainstream framework continues operating as if the anomalies don't exist. The near-death experience research is one of the most significant examples of this phenomenon in contemporary science. 50 years of peer-reviewed publication, thousands of documented cases across dozens of countries and cultures. Researchers at major academic institutions, NYU, University of Virginia, University of Southampton, University of Amsterdam, producing findings that resist conventional explanation, and a mainstream scientific and cultural conversation that has largely declined to engage seriously with what those findings actually show. This video is the engagement that the mainstream has declined to have. Not credulous, not dismissive, honest. We are going to survey the full body of NDE research from its historical roots through the contemporary clinical literature. We are going to look at the specific cases that most resist conventional explanation. We are going to examine the skeptical objections carefully and honestly, including the ones that have genuine force. And we are going to make the case explicitly that this evidence is more significant than the mainstream conversation has acknowledged. By the end of this video, you will have a more complete picture of what the NDE research actually shows than most people who have read about it casually or dismissed it without examining it seriously. Let's begin at the beginning. The historical foundation. The near-death experience is not a modern phenomenon. It is one of the most consistently documented human experiences across every culture and every century for which we have records. The ancient Egyptian Book of the Dead, one of the oldest religious texts in human history, contains detailed accounts of consciousness navigating the post-death transition. The specific features it describes: leaving the body, moving through a transitional realm, encountering a judgment or review, reaching a threshold beyond which some may not return. Plato's Republic contains the account of a soldier killed in battle who experienced the afterlife in detail and was sent back to report what he found. Er's account includes leaving the body, observing it from above, traveling to a place where souls were judged, witnessing a panoramic review of lives, and returning with specific information about what he had seen. The Tibetan Bardo Todol, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, composed in the 8th century, provides a detailed map of the consciousness transitions following death. It describes the clear light of awareness encountered immediately at death, the subsequent transitional states, the experiences that arise in those states, and the process by which consciousness eventually returns to physical embodiment. These texts were not written in contact with each other. Tibet and Greece and ancient Egypt were not exchanging manuscripts. The convergence of what they describe is not literary borrowing. It is independent documentation of the same territory. Medieval Christian mystical literature is full of accounts of deathbed visions, near-death experiences, and consciousness surviving the body's apparent death. The collected accounts of dying saints and ordinary believers across medieval Europe describe with remarkable consistency the same features: leaving the body, moving toward light, encountering deceased relatives, reaching a boundary, returning with a transformed understanding of death. In the 19th century, as medicine developed the capacity to resuscitate people who had technically died and returned, the accounts multiplied. Physicians began noting with increasing frequency that patients resuscitated from apparent death described experiences during the period of clinical death. The accounts were consistent across patients who had no contact with each other and no shared framework for what they were describing. By the early 20th century, the phenomenon was sufficiently documented that the Society for Psychical Research in Britain, founded in 1882, and including among its members serious scientists and philosophers, had assembled thousands of cases of deathbed visions, near-death experiences, and related phenomena. The question was not whether the phenomenon existed. It was clearly and consistently documented. The question was what it meant. That question became the foundation of the modern scientific investigation. The modern clinical research. The modern scientific investigation of near-death experiences began seriously in 1975 with the publication of Raymond Moody's Life After Life. Moody was a philosopher and physician. He was not attempting to prove survival of consciousness. He was attempting to document a phenomenon that kept appearing in his clinical work and that had no established scientific framework for understanding. What he found, across 150 cases, was a set of features appearing with remarkable consistency across people who had been resuscitated from clinical death. People with no prior contact with each other, across different ages, backgrounds, and religious orientations. The features Moody documented became the foundational taxonomy of NDE research, leaving the body and observing it from above, a dark tunnel or passageway, movement toward light, a border or boundary, an encounter with deceased relatives or beings of light, a life review, panoramic, detailed, emotionally complete, a return to the body, often unwilled, accompanied by a transformed relationship to death and life. Moody's work was not peer-reviewed clinical research. It was a physician's careful documentation of a consistent phenomenon. Its significance was in establishing the taxonomy, the consistent features that subsequent rigorous research would investigate. Kenneth Ring took the work into the academic literature. A professor of psychology at the University of Connecticut, Ring published Life at Death in 1980, the first systematic academic study of NDE is using structured interviews and standardized methodology. Ring's findings confirmed and refined Moody's taxonomy. He also documented the consistent after effects: loss of fear of death, increased compassion, reduced materialism, spiritual transformation, that appeared reliably across NDE experiences, regardless of prior belief. Michael Sabom, a cardiologist, approached the research from explicit skepticism. He was convinced that the NDE accounts could be explained by prior knowledge of resuscitation procedures, that patients were describing what they imagined or expected rather than what they actually perceived. He designed a study to test this. He compared the NDE accounts of patients who described watching their own resuscitation against the accounts of patients who had been through resuscitation but had not reported an NDE. The NDE experiencers described their resuscitations with significantly greater accuracy than the control group. Sabom became one of the most important researchers in the field, precisely because he entered as a skeptic and followed the evidence. Then came the work that changed everything. In 2001, Pim van Lommel, a Dutch cardiologist at Rhine State Hospital, published the results of a prospective study in the Lancet. Prospective means the methodology was designed before the data was collected, not a retrospective analysis of existing accounts. A rigorous, pre-designed clinical study following 344 cardiac arrest patients across multiple hospitals over a period of years. The findings were unambiguous. Of the 344 patients who had been clinically dead, no heartbeat, no respiration, no measurable brain activity, and then resuscitated, 62 reported detailed conscious experiences during the period of clinical death. Van Lommel's study was the most methodologically rigorous NDE study ever published, and it was published in the Lancet, one of the 2 or 3 most respected medical journals in the world. The findings could not be explained by oxygen deprivation. The patients who reported NDEs were not distinguishable from those who did not on the basis of hypoxia severity. They could not be explained by prior medication. The drug profiles of NDE reporters and non-reporters were not significantly different. They could not be explained by psychological expectation. A significant number of the NDE experiencers had no prior knowledge of near-death experiences and did not expect to have one. Van Lommel's conclusion, published in the Lancet: the NDE data is not consistent with the hypothesis that consciousness is produced by the brain. The verified perception cases. The most significant evidence in the NDE literature is not the phenomenological accounts, the tunnels, the lights, the life reviews. Those are consistent and cross-cultural and resist conventional explanation. But the most significant evidence is the verified perception cases. These are accounts in which patients who were clinically dead, by every available measure, reported accurate perceptions of their physical environment during the period of clinical death, perceptions they could not have had through any conventional sensory channel. Let me describe the most important ones. The dentures case, Van Lommel's study. A patient was brought into the hospital in a coma following cardiac arrest. During resuscitation, the medical team removed his dentures and placed them in a specific drawer in the crash cart. When the patient regained consciousness, he described his resuscitation in detail, including the nurse who had removed his dentures and the specific drawer where they had been placed. He described this from a vantage point above the resuscitation team. He had been clinically dead when the dentures were removed. Van Lommel investigated this case personally and verified the specific details: the drawer location, the nurse involved, the sequence of events. The Pam Reynolds case. Pam Reynolds was a musician who underwent a surgical procedure called hypothermic cardiac arrest, a procedure in which the brain is cooled to the point of complete cessation of all measurable neural activity. The heartbeat is stopped, and the blood is drained from the brain to allow surgery on a brain aneurysm. During this procedure, during which she had no measurable brain activity, no heartbeat, no blood in her brain, and her eyes were taped shut, and her ears plugged with speakers emitting measured clicks, she reported detailed observations of the surgical procedure. She described the specific surgical instrument used to open her skull. She described its appearance in accurate detail, a detail her surgical team confirmed was not something she could have seen or known from normal medical knowledge. She described a conversation between 2 surgical team members about the size of her femoral arteries. All of this during a procedure specifically designed to eliminate all possible neural activity. The Pam Reynolds case is the most investigated single NDE case in the literature. Skeptics have spent decades attempting to find conventional explanations. None of the conventional explanations, residual brain activity, anesthetic awareness, prior knowledge of the procedure, adequately account for the specific verified details. Kenneth Ring's blind sight cases. Kenneth Ring documented cases of blind patients, some blind from birth, who reported accurate visual perceptions during NDEs. One of the most significant was a woman blind from birth who during her NDE reported accurate visual perceptions of the operating room where she was being resuscitated, the equipment, the staff, the colors. She had never seen anything. She had no visual memories to draw on. She had no framework for visual experience. and yet her descriptions of what she saw were accurate. The shoecase social worker, Kimberly Clark Sharp, reported a case in which a patient named Maria, resuscitated from cardiac arrest, reported leaving her body and traveling through the hospital. She reported seeing a specific object, a worn tennis shoe, on a specific ledge of the hospital building, visible only from the outside of the building at a height of several stories. Sharp investigated and found the shoe exactly where Maria had described it, in the specific location, with the specific wear pattern Maria had described. Maria had been in the cardiac care unit during her cardiac arrest. She had no way of knowing the shoe was there. These cases are not isolated. The NDE literature contains dozens of cases with verified perceptions confirmed by independent witnesses after the fact, perceptions of objects and conversations and events that occurred during the period of clinical death, perceptions from vantage points that were not physically accessible to the body. The skeptical objections. I want to address the skeptical objections seriously, because some of them have genuine force, and because engaging with them honestly is more useful than dismissing them. Objection 1. Oxygen deprivation produces hallucinations. This is the most common conventional explanation. The brain under hypoxic stress produces vivid hallucinations that feel real and coherent. The objection has genuine force as a partial explanation. Oxygen deprivation does produce altered states. Tunnel experiences and light phenomena can be produced by hypoxia in laboratory conditions. But the objection fails to account for several things. Van Lommel's study found no correlation between hypoxia severity and NDE incidence. Patients with more severe oxygen deprivation were not more likely to report NDEs. If hypoxia were the mechanism, this correlation should exist. More significantly, hypoxia produces confused, fragmented, typically negative experiences. NDEs are overwhelmingly coherent, detailed, and positive. The phenomenological quality is not consistent with hypoxic hallucination, and the objection cannot account for the verified perception cases at all. Oxygen deprivation cannot produce accurate perceptions of the external environment from a vantage point outside the body. Objection 2. Residual brain activity accounts for the experiences. The brain doesn't stop instantly. There may be residual activity after apparent clinical death that produces the experiences before true cessation. This objection has some force for cardiac arrest cases, where the definition of clinical death is relatively brief. It has no force for the Pam Reynolds case. Her brain was specifically cooled to the point of complete electrical silence. There was no residual activity to account for, and it cannot account for the timing problem. Many NDE experiencers report experiences that, based on the timeline of their resuscitation, appear to have occurred during the deepest phase of their clinical death rather than at the beginning or end of it. Objection 3. The accounts are reconstructed after the fact. Patients hear medical staff discussing what happened during the procedure and incorporate that information into a confabulated narrative that feels like a real memory. This objection has genuine force as a general concern about memory reliability, but it cannot account for cases where the patient reported accurate information about events that were not discussed with them after the procedure, such as the shoe case, where the specific location of the shoe was not known to the medical staff and was not discussed. It also cannot account for the verified perceptions of NDE experiencers who described accurate details that the medical staff themselves didn't know they had noticed, or that were not discussed in any post-procedure conversation. Objection 4. Anesthetic awareness. Patients under general anesthesia sometimes have partial awareness of what is occurring. The NDE accounts reflect this awareness, not a consciousness outside the body. This objection cannot account for cardiac arrest, NDEs, where no anesthesia was involved, or for NDEs during periods of complete cardiac and neurological cessation, or for the Pam Reynolds case, where the specific design of the procedure was intended to eliminate any possible awareness through conventional mechanisms. Objection 5. Confirmation bias in the research. Researchers who believe in consciousness survival find evidence for it. The research is not objective. This objection has the most general force. All research is subject to confirmation bias, and the NDE field is not exempt. But it does not apply to researchers who entered as skeptics and followed the evidence. Michael Sabom, Sam Parnia. Both entered the field skeptical. Both found the evidence more compelling than their prior assumptions had prepared them for. And the Lancet, which published Van Lommel's study, does not have a known bias toward consciousness survival research. Its peer review process is among the most rigorous in medical publishing. The rebuttal. Having engaged with the objections, honestly, I want to now be equally honest about what survives them. The conventional explanations, hypoxia, residual brain activity, post hoc reconstruction, anesthetic awareness, are not without merit as partial explanations for some aspects of some NDE accounts, but none of them, individually or collectively, adequately explains the verified perception cases. This is the point that the mainstream dismissal consistently fails to engage with directly. The verified perception cases are not accounts of subjective experience that might be explained by altered brain states. They are accounts of accurate perceptions of the external physical environment, verified by independent witnesses after the fact, that occurred during periods of clinical death. For a conventional explanation to work, it must explain not just why people have vivid experiences during clinical death. That is at least partially explicable. It must explain how a person with no measurable brain activity and no functioning sensory apparatus accurately perceived specific details of their external environment from a vantage point that was not their body. That is a different and much harder problem. The Pam Reynolds case alone, with its combination of complete neural cessation and accurate detailed perceptions, has been investigated for decades by skeptical researchers. No conventional explanation has been produced that adequately accounts for it. The shoe case has been investigated. The dentures case has been investigated. The blind sight cases have been investigated. What the investigations consistently find is not a conventional explanation. They find the absence of a conventional explanation. And the absence of a conventional explanation for a well-documented phenomenon is not the same as the phenomenon not occurring. It is the phenomenon waiting for a framework adequate to explain it. The framework the materialist paradigm cannot provide, because it assumed its conclusion before examining the evidence. The mainstream dismissal. Given the weight and quality of the evidence I just described, 50 years of research, peer-reviewed publications, verified perception cases that resist conventional explanation, skeptic researchers who followed the data and found it compelling, the question that demands honest engagement is this: why has the mainstream scientific and cultural conversation not engaged with it seriously? Not why has it not accepted the survival hypothesis? That would require a different standard of evidence and is a legitimate position. Why has it not engaged with the evidence seriously? Why does the standard popular science account of consciousness not mention Van Lommel's Lancet study? Why does the standard neuroscience curriculum not include Grayson's 40 years of research at the University of Virginia? Why is Pam Reynolds not a standard case study in the philosophy of mind? I gave part of the answer in episode 2, institutional investment, a vast infrastructure of practice, training, funding, and professional identity built on the materialist assumption. Disrupting that assumption has costs that the evidence alone cannot override. But there is a second factor that is less discussed. The NDE evidence, if taken seriously, does not just challenge a scientific hypothesis. It challenges the cultural management of death. Death is the most frightening fact of human existence. Modern secular culture has developed a specific way of managing that fear by asserting, with the authority of science, that death is the end, that there is nothing after, that the terror of non-existence is the honest facing of reality. That assertion, consciousness ends at death, functions psychologically as a kind of certainty. And certainty, even about something terrifying, is less anxiety-producing than genuine, open uncertainty. The NDE evidence opens the question. It says, we genuinely don't know. The evidence suggests consciousness may continue. But we don't know what that continuation looks like, how long it persists, what determines its character. That open uncertainty is for many people more frightening than the certainty of nothing. And so the evidence is dismissed, not because it has been refuted, because the question it opens is one the culture has decided it would rather not sit with. The case made explicitly. I want to make the case explicitly, without hedging, without the performed balance that treats a well-documented phenomenon and its dismissal as equally defensible positions. The NDE evidence is more significant than the mainstream conversation has acknowledged. Not because it proves consciousness survival. Evidence of this complexity doesn't produce proof. Anyone who tells you it does is overstating the case. But because it meets the standard of evidence that, in any other domain of scientific inquiry, would demand serious engagement rather than institutional dismissal. 50 years of peer-reviewed publication. Findings replicated across multiple independent research groups in multiple countries. Prospective methodology, not just retrospective case collection, published in the most rigorously reviewed journals in medicine. Verified perception cases that have been investigated by skeptical researchers and have not yielded adequate conventional explanations. Consistent cross-cultural phenomenology, the same features appearing across accounts from people with no shared cultural framework or prior knowledge of NDE literature. Consistent after effects, loss of fear of death, increased compassion, reduced materialism, long-term personality transformation that distinguish NDE experiences from comparison groups in ways that are documented and reproducible. Researchers who entered the field as skeptics and found the evidence more compelling than their prior assumptions. If this body of evidence existed in any other domain, if 50 years of peer-reviewed research showing a consistent, cross-cultural, verified phenomenon in any other area of investigation were being dismissed without adequate counter-evidence, the scientific community would recognize that dismissal as a failure of the scientific process. It would not be celebrated as rigor. It would be identified as bias. The honest position, the position that the evidence actually supports, is not that consciousness survives death. The honest position is that we have a substantial body of evidence suggesting consciousness can function in the apparent absence of brain activity, that this evidence has not been adequately explained by conventional mechanisms, and that the question of what happens to consciousness at death is genuinely open in a way the mainstream narrative refuses to acknowledge. That is the honest position. And honesty about the state of the evidence is not credulity. It is the basic requirement of intellectual integrity. Personal anchor and close. I have kept my personal account minimal in this episode intentionally. The research carries this episode. It should carry it. 50 years of serious investigation by serious researchers deserves to stand on its own without requiring the weight of a personal testimony to make it credible. But I want to close with something brief and direct. I am a case, not in the self-aggrandizing sense, in the clinical sense. A 7-year-old child, a 2-foot steak, the back of the neck. 3 months in a coma with no measurable brain activity in the period that mattered most. And conversations, physician conversations, clinical discussions, words exchanged in a room where I was, by every available measure, unconscious, recalled accurately when I came back. That account has never been formally written up in the peer-reviewed literature. The physicians from that period are both deceased. The documentation that exists is clinical, not investigative. But the account is consistent with every feature the literature documents as characteristic of verified NDE perception. The vantage point outside the body, the accuracy of the environmental perceptions, the recall of information that was not available through conventional sensory channels. I am not citing my experience as proof of consciousness survival. I am citing it as what the researchers would call a case. A case that is consistent with the body of evidence this episode has surveyed. A case that the conventional explanations, oxygen deprivation, residual brain activity, post hoc reconstruction, do not adequately account for. A case that has been living inside the person presenting this research for 54 years. And that is precisely why this series exists. Not because I read about this evidence from a comfortable distance and found it intellectually interesting. Because I woke up from 3 months in a coma at 7 years old, carrying information I should not have had. And spent the next 54 years building a framework large enough to understand what that means. This series is that framework. Next in this series, Consciousness and the Divine Mind, where the research meets the revelation. What the UC Truth Principles and Divine Mind framework say about what consciousness actually is, and why that framework holds up under the pressure of the evidence we've just examined. Link above. Take care of yourself.